Hello, my name is Lindy Jung and welcome back to my channel. I am an author tuber and a writer, and I talk about books, writing, travel, and basically whatever else I feel like. So welcome back to part 2 of my fantasy world building series. I wanted to do a little bit of a caveat first because I am changing things up just the tiniest bit around here. I'll be uploading less frequently for one thing. I've been uploading pretty much once a week on Sundays for a couple months now, I want to say, or a little bit less. It's really hard to tell what's been going on with time. I'm completely lost in the sauce. I don't know what year it is. But in any case, yes, a little bit less frequent on the uploads just because I want to focus on quality over quantity at this point. I will continue to put out those lighter toned lifestyle and writing vlogs, I guess. Any vlog is going to be on the lighter side. But when it comes to my writing craft videos, I'm going to be going for a more video essay / podcast style. So we're going to be going a lot more in depth and a little bit longer. I'll be doing research again for these videos, which I did when I first started this channel, but it was a lot more tongue-in-cheek. My goal is to create specific and helpful videos that are geared toward writers who really want to hone their craft. So if you're looking for that, that's basically what I'm going to be putting out from now on. And for these types of craft videos, I will always appreciate any and all feedback you guys have for me. I definitely want to know what you guys want to see more of or what topics you'd like me to cover. So please let me know in the comments below. Anyway, with that being said, welcome back to the series. Let's build a fake world together. So the title pretty much says it all. We're going to cover 3 areas of world building today that I've sort of lumped together as the more general ones that you don't have to necessarily focus on in terms of detail as much and might not impact the plot significantly, but are also super important for just sort of building your world from the ground up. The first of these topics is geography. The goal here is to create a physical base for your world. It's pretty straightforward. The purpose is to create a physical reference for your world for yourself and the reader. Having a solid geographical foundation for your fantasy world will allow you to write more believable travel and just sort of consider the physicalness, the physical aspects of your world. Geography is also important because it can and definitely does play a part in cultural and political relationships, but we're going to get into that a little bit later because that's just a bigger topic. And what can happen with fantasy that doesn't consider geography? I have a very prime example here. I actually have not caught up with Game of Thrones, but I was eating up the Twitter drama when that last season was airing. And do you remember how in season 8, I think it was, the worst season, the last season, they filmed some shots of King's Landing that had no ocean, no water. And everyone was like, where is the water? Because up until that point, King's Landing had always been shot in Dubrovnik, which is a seaside town. So there was almost always water just beyond the walls. And the writers just like forgot about it, I guess. Like they forgot about a lot of things, as we all know. But it's these inconsistencies that can create a sort of loss of suspension of disbelief, which is a phrase that I'll be saying a lot in this video. Because a big reason that these 3 parts of world building are so critical are because they create that sense of suspension of disbelief for the reader. You're making a world that is more believable, that might not look exactly like the world that we live in, but has sort of the same set of rules, or at least has its own internal logic. Of course, like always, your mileage may vary here. I forgot to put my usual caveat at the beginning, which is that prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds. I don't believe in that. I think this is just a really helpful set of advice because I've been personally looking to write harder leaning fantasy, and this is definitely important for that. But again, your mileage may vary. If you're writing a dreamier fantasy, if your tone is just not that hard, if you're writing soft fantasy or fantasy that just, you know, you don't have to care about world building this much. No one says you have to, but it's an interesting topic. So let's go ahead and talk about how to create fantasy geography. Step 1 is basically to sketch out a map or generate it. There's actually a lot of really great fantasy map generation tools for pretty much all sets of purposes, and you can just play around with those until you find a basis that you really like. And this is just going to be the shape of your countries, where the water is, the really, really bare bones basics, like essentially the outline of what you would see when you open a book cover for the first time. At this point, you can also write out your main cities and regions or countries. Depends on sort of how you want to delineate those things. That's more of the politics side, but it's good to have an idea of where things are. Ideally, you'd be sketching out this map sometime after you've come up with the basics of your story, so you have a general idea of where your actual plot and your characters are physically located. If you don't, I don't think I can help you. figure that out and then come back to this. But that's sort of the core of where your world building is going to blossom out from. You're going to figure out where your characters are. If you have multiple in different places, figure that out and then sort of draw out the lines as you go out. But you're going to really want to focus on where they are and building upon that part of the world first. Tip number 1 here is to take a look at real maps. The generations are really great because they create really believable coastlines. When I'm hand drawing maps, everything is weirdly smooth, which is fine at first, but after a while I'm like, I don't really know how tectonic plates work. I don't think I know enough about geology to draw a convincing coastline. Another thing that's cool to do while you look at real maps is to consider the implications of geography on people. You don't have to get too into it, but thinking about the location of ports, bridges, rivers, anything that people might use to get around, like what kind of roads will they need, and will they have to construct over rivers, or will they have to navigate the sea? These are just general big picture ideas to think about. Tip number 2 is to think about your place names. You don't need to come up with a conlang for every fantasy world you create. If I did that, I think I would literally go insane. But sort of standardizing naming conventions is a really helpful way to make a world seem believable. For example, it makes sense if the river of unending laughter feeds into the lake of 1,000 sorrows. Those names feel like they come from the same set of people, the same sort of mythos. They might even have interlocking backstories or something like that, or legends attached to them. But if you have that same lake of 1,000 sorrows and it's fed into by a river called Paul, it just doesn't click as much. I feel like you could make it work. You can theoretically make anything work, but it doesn't immediately connect in your brain in the same way. So just considering naming conventions, and this can be regional, it depends on how much you want to get into it. Obviously, there's 1,000 different ways you can play around with this. Step 2 in the actual map making, geography forming process. Step 2 is to pick out some notable landmarks. These would probably be like mountains, major rivers, man-made things even. Something memorable and unique is always fun and will definitely like create a lasting image. You can think about symbolism here, you can think about theme, especially if you have this like gritty political novel where people's allegiances are always creating issues, and like, I don't know, one of the major symbols in the capital city is a giant golden statue of a king who fell on his own sword or something like that. In general, cities in the real world usually have some sort of major feature that makes them stand out, that gives them sort of like their own identity. Not a lot of cities, except for the ones in America, which not even all the ones in America are like this. Not a lot of them are very flavorless and just buildings upon buildings. There's always some sort of local quirk, like the Statue of Liberty even, or, you know, LA has its horrible twisted knot of traffic. That's a landmark, right? Step 3 is to start mapping out the nitty-gritty, so cities and borders, and other things that are smaller that I can't think of off the top of my head. One tip here is that you can really start playing 3-dimensional chess with it, so you can consider travel logistics, agricultural needs, resources, and so on and so forth. I think a big thing to think about with geography is travel, like how do people get around and what is the main mode of transportation? What are the major roads? Are they regulated in any way? Are they kept up, or are they sort of like full of bandits? Have people gotten really good at seafaring, or are people just really handy with boats, or do they fly? There's so many different ways to consider how people get from one place to the next, and it's actually like a really complicated thing. Travel limitations have created a lot of issues for humans in the past and have shaped so much human history. Another little side note here is I will keep saying humans, but it obviously applies for any intelligent fantasy species, or whatever you want to call us in your world. Anyway, as you're building your cities and borders, consider, especially for borders, natural borders. A lot of countries are delineated by rivers, mountain ranges, things that are not easily passable, and that will be sort of a natural border, and the rest of the borders are sort of drawn around it. Are any borders disputed? Will this potentially lead to any sort of geopolitical conflict? And terraforming. How have people in this society shaped the natural topography over time to suit their own needs? Have they fully just taken out mountains and hills in order to plant seeds, crops, livestock? Have they sort of adapted to it instead and created a more mountainous lifestyle? I don't necessarily know what that might look like for you, but you could definitely build upon that. Have they created any natural freshwater resources like lakes, dams? How have they shaped the world just by being there and forcing it to suit their needs? Number 4 here is to vary your biomes. So a biome is, I can only think in terms of Minecraft. I'm literally in biology, but a biome is a specific type of ecosystem with a certain set of plants and animals and a very specific natural landscape. Like, for example, a swamp. That instantly brings to mind, you know, like wetlands, lots of trees, maybe moss draping down, lots of bugs, swamp birds. There's a lot of different types of biomes in the world. There's a lot of different things you can play around with. Not everything has to be a forest. I'm also like a #1 forest fan, but it doesn't all have to be a forest, you guys. There's a lot of interesting types of ecosystems. I'm trying really hard to not say biome. There's so many different things to play around with. We'll get a little bit more into this in the ecology section of this video, but I just wanted to mention biomes here because they are a feature of geography and they do play a huge part in how you're going to end up shaping your world. You're putting humans on top of something that already existed before, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. They can shape it, but it's kind of always going to look the way that it already looked before. Anyway, with biomes in mind, a tip here is to think about what biomes actually occur next to each other and what is or isn't physically possible. Again, you can come up with any sort of exception to the rule. It is fantasy, there are no rules, but for example, a cave isn't really going to happen in a swamp because it's all muddy, so a cave would just be a hole in the ground. So yeah, just keeping logic in mind. Part 2 of this little video is ecology. And this is a very clear case of my biologist bias. I could talk about ecology forever. I honestly do not think it is a huge factor of consideration for a lot of even harder fantasy writers because it's not critically important. It kind of happens on its own as you build the other aspects of a world, but I just think it's super fun to consider. I personally really like it when fantasy books delve into ecology in any sort of way, and specifically consider the relationship between ecology and people and vice versa. So the goal here is to flesh out the natural world and its systems and its relationship with people. The purpose is, again, this helps maintain suspension of disbelief. All people, even if you grew up in the most urban jungle of urban jungles, you are sort of keyed into how the natural world works. You kind of understand that if you're in the Arctic and you see a rattlesnake, that is not normal. But another thing here is that considering ecology and really playing around with it does create a more dynamic and interesting world, in my opinion. Especially if the fantasy world you're working with and developing is more rustic, which is to say, a little bit more back in the past, a little bit more people are super closely tied to nature and don't necessarily live in huge cities. There's still very much a direct link between people and nature for the most part. Have you ever read a book where a fantasy creature, let's say dragons, exists? Let's say they've been tamed by humans for the most part, but you know that in the back of your head you understand that at some point these animals were wild, and you understand that this is an apex predator, it breathes fire, it flies, and it had to have some sort of impact on nature. If dragons have been domesticated enough that they've been taken out of the ecosystem that they're from entirely, then what did that do to the ecosystem? If they haven't been domesticated that well, and if they're being imported all over the world and being set loose, potentially in places where they did not exist to begin with, then what are they doing to those places? So it's all about these relationships, these systems. They're very delicately balanced in the real world, and they probably will be in your fantasy world as well. Anyway, how to do it, how to write fantasy ecology. Point number 1, you should probably already have a basic map ready if you are doing this in order. I don't know why you would be, but you should have a general idea of what your world's geography looks like. Again, we're going to think about what biomes and habitats and ecosystems exist in your core region or within the world as a whole. If you don't have biomes ready off the top of your head, you can consider places you've been to or places you've read about as real world examples. I've been personally really wanting to write like a cloud forest biome because I went to Costa Rica where there were cloud forests, and I just thought that was a really cool thing. Another cool one is an elfin forest, which is just a forest where everything is really stunted, usually because there's a lot of wind or a higher elevation. So again, not everything needs to be a forest, or if it is a forest, it can be an interesting kind of forest and not just the same sort of bland, you know, we filmed this in Canada because it was cheaper, deciduous sort of, or I guess coniferous, endless pines upon endless pines, that kind of thing. Step 2, now that you have your biomes ready, think about what they looked like before the arrival of humans. What animals and plants were really prevalent? How did they survive? Again, you can use real life examples as an aid to sort of develop this, or you can just straight up use a real life biome. I think one of the benefits of using reality to sort of base this off of is, again, it becomes familiar, it becomes recognizable, and it has actual real world logic built in, baked in already, so it's gonna really help with suspension of disbelief. Number 3 is think about the challenges and advantages present to human beings or your intelligent species of choice in this area. Tip number 1 is it's really important to think about how the average climate or temperature would affect people. Temperature's a really big one. Like, people just do not do well in the cold without a lot of resources. Less food available, probably less water available. You're gonna need a lot of clothes and a way to stay warm at night. It's harder to get around. Like, it's really difficult to survive in the cold. But even in a biome like a really dense forest or super rocky mountainous terrain, that's gonna make farming really difficult for people. They might have a more foraging heavy lifestyle as a result. They're probably not gonna keep huge herds of livestock, and that's going to create issues in terms of getting protein or dairy, which contains a lot of calcium, etc. So basically thinking about how the very first people in this area had to eke out a living, like really fight to survive. That can really contextualize how cultures developed, how people developed, how their attitudes may have changed over time. It could affect religion. Maybe they pray for less snow. Maybe they think snow is out to get them. I don't know. You can also think about what advancements people have had to make. Snowshoes. I'm really only thinking of snow here, but there's obviously other climates to adapt to. Tip number 2 is more of my, like, I don't even know what to say, person who's read Braiding Sweetgrass caveat. It's that not all human relationships with nature are negative. Robin Wall Kimmerer talked about how she surveyed a bunch of, I think, environmental studies students in a class once and was like, can humans and nature coexist happily? And all of them said no, pretty much, and that's just not true because we have coexisted for a really long time. We have in modern times definitely been doing some shit, causing some harm, but that doesn't mean that was always the case, and that doesn't mean we have to carry that mindset into our fantasy. Humans and nature can have a positive impact on each other, and that includes humans having a positive impact on nature, and I think that'd be a really cool thing to see more of in fantasy that considers ecology a little bit more. Anyway, tip number 3 is consider what resources are scarce or just completely absent in this particular area. For example, if fresh water is really hard to access, people are gonna have to get that. Vitamin C, protein, like I said, any sort of vitamin deficiency could happen. Sunlight, vitamin D deficiency, that's what I got. There's almost always going to be something. There's always almost going to be something that has to be really fought for or cultivated or traded, and that is going to be super important to consider moving forward. Step number 5 kind of goes hand in hand with climate, but it's more about seasons. So it's basically just considering what seasons exist. You do not have to stick to the 4-season rule. I do not live in a place with 4 seasons, and I have grown up very happily in California for most of my life. Pretty much only lived in a place with 4 seasons once. A lot of places do not, especially tropical areas, especially areas that are a little bit closer to the equator. You can consider 2-season systems, monsoon seasons. Consider how people are going to have to change with the seasons in terms of what resources they gather, what foraging or hunting they might prioritize. Are they going to start harvesting really quickly and like pickling things so they can eat it through the winter? I don't know, mix it up. I think George R.R. Martin kind of did the like 2-season Game of Thrones thing on purpose because he maybe didn't want to think about this. I mean, it is very important to the plot, and I think he justified it really well, but having like years-long summers and winters and only having 2 seasons is really funny to me. I'm kind of in the back of my head like he just didn't want to think about seasons or like write about seasons too much, and honestly iconic, but not everyone can do that, and I think seasons are kind of a fun thing to consider, so you know, your mileage may vary. Step number 5 is to consider what plant and animal species are naturally occurring in this area. And then also consider which ones are introduced and the impact they might have. You don't have to be a biologist about this. You can be like, okay, people brought sheep because they want wool. Wolves eat sheep. People don't like wolves, so they start hunting wolves. That happened so many times throughout human history. It's a big reason why wolves are so not prevalent in huge parts of America. It can be something a little bit more interesting and less of an ecology cliche, like for example in Florida the fucking pythons got loose because people were keeping them as pets very irresponsibly, and then they would get loose, and now there are pythons everywhere in Florida because that is very close to their natural habitat, so they're doing really well there. And they also have no natural predators, so they're just everywhere, and people have to hunt them. And I think there's like an annual python hunt, I'd have to double check this, where basically people get paid for the number of pythons that they bring in. Sort of in that line of thinking, you also want to think about how humans interact with species that are actively dangerous or harmful to them. This isn't just animals like venomous snakes or apex predators, this could also be plants or fungi. You can also think about how humans might have belief systems developed around creatures that are really prevalent or that they really have close relationships with. For example, people might get really they might get the shit kicked out of them by wolves, but they could still respect them and have some sort of mythos around them. Same with bears or deer, whatever. It could be whatever. Another thing to consider, and bear with me here, is plants. I really truly think that people don't for the most part, think about plants until it's convenient to them. And that is frustrating to me because I work with plants. And I also just straight up love plants. Like, one of my hobbies is going around and looking at plants. I'm just 100% serious. Plants are obviously very important to ecosystem function, and they're also very important to human life. I read so many books that are about the main characters hunting to feed themselves. People were also gatherers, you know, especially, you know, the hunter-gatherer system. Gathering was a huge part of it because not only did you gather for food, you also gathered to maybe use plants as textiles, to build things, to burn wood. There's a huge range of plant life that can help people survive. That includes medicinal plants, psychotropic plants. That's not gonna help you survive, but it's still cool. Plants to eat, plants that store water, plants that grow on the certain side of a tree or a rock to tell you what direction you're heading. Plants that provide shade, plants that provide shelter, cultivated plants. Flowers are just beautiful. I love flowers. There's just so many plants. There's so many more plants than animals, and animals, they move around and they cause problems, so we think about them a little bit more, but plants are also very, very important. They're also super cool, and this is absolutely plant propaganda. I want people to look into plants and learn about them and become obsessed with them because they're fascinating. I don't know if that'll actually work, but you can definitely consider plants and get really into them. But considering plants and their role in your fantasy world is just like a really cool and important thing to do. Number 6 circles back to my little example of how stories that do not consider ecology in their fantasy world can kind of go awry, and that is if you have some sort of made-up species that's really prevalent in your story. Dragons, elves, fairies, I was gonna say witches, I don't think that's a separate species. Anything like that, griffins, I don't know, selkies. Think about the impact of this fantastical species on your natural world. What part of the food chain do they inhabit? Where do they live? Can they coexist with humans, or do they actively pose a threat? Were they here first? They usually were. All of these are ecological aspects you can consider. Now moving on to part 3, which is the history. The goal here is to contextualize your fantasy society with the past. The purpose is, for the third time, suspension of disbelief. Also, considering history's impact on your current fantasy society is really important because frankly, no civilization exists in a vacuum or sprang out of nothing. I feel like a really common example of stories that sort of lack this element of historical world building is any sort of fantasy story that features a ruthless dictator or, you know, some bullshit like the annual competition where kids are thrown into a ring and they have to kill each other for entertainment. If there's no historical reasoning for how society got to that point, it doesn't make sense. Like, it's just not, like, why? Why would we do that? We're human beings. We're from the same stock as your fantasy characters. It would take a lot for us to get to that point. And things like that, not necessarily the kids murdering each other in an arena for entertainment. Awful things have happened in history and they've all come from something. I just really, really notice it when stuff like that, when plot elements like that occur for basically no reason. And I get that writers are looking for a big conflict, right? They want an antagonist that feels really big and really scary, and maybe they haven't thought about where those big scary things came from in the real world so much. But when I see that, I just think it's so jarring, I think it's a little bit shallow, and it just feels like BS. Like, I feel like you're joking me right now, and I just completely lose investment in the conflict because you're not justifying it enough. It needs to be justified, and you need to kind of understand what the root of an evil is to fight the evil in the first place. And you also need to understand that so you don't end up repeating the same mistakes again. Yeah, it's true that human history repeats itself and we don't learn, but that doesn't have to be the case in fantasy, right? Anyway, how to write history in fantasy. Step number 1 is to look into real human history. I've definitely talked about this before on this channel, but I seriously think that studying and understanding real history, and not in any really in-depth way, I've only taken a couple history classes and I like to read really long Wikipedia pages and occasionally look up historical articles. Borrowing from real human history or using that as a basis for your world is a really good way to make a world feel fleshed out and realistic. But again, it's not enough to just grab from random events or figures, buildings, aesthetics. That's another thing I see is people will be like, this book is based off of the 1920s and it's just like girls in flapper dresses and champagne and dancing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I just find it frustrating that there isn't context for this society, or there's no reason for it to be that way. I feel like borrowing from the aesthetics, especially in an era where the aesthetics are such a result of like a more repressive time right before, is just so I don't know, it just feels so shallow to me. Anyway, instead of just grabbing random pieces of history, think about how you could really contextualize the events that are occurring. You can consider how society came to be that way instead of just writing it in a bubble. I guess a second example is that the 1950s sort of, poodle skirt and beehive hairdo era, it did not just spring up out of nowhere. And I'm specifically talking about the 50s in the United States. The society and the mindset and the economics of that, it was like a really big economic boom. All of that was a direct result of everything that came before, especially World War II. And we even see a lot of those influences from the 40s, 30s, and 50s and onward in our modern society as well. A lot of conservative people harken back to the 50s because they think that was sort of the golden era of society, even though there were a lot of problems. America was really in its propaganda era. It was really harping on that like American lifestyle and traditional gender roles and families. I mean, there's so much more. I am by no means an expert on the 50s. That's kind of all I understand about the consequences of that particular era. So I'll leave it there, but you kind of see where I'm coming from, right? There's no such thing as just a historical aesthetic. There's no such thing as a time period that exists in a bubble. It all came from somewhere. People either consciously or subconsciously shifted their behavior and their clothing and their lifestyles in a certain direction because of either mass media and propaganda or just things that happened to them previously, or it's all reactionary. And it's so interesting. It's so interesting. And once you start thinking about those connections and how things came to be, you kind of can't stop, and you see it everywhere. And you see it in fantasy. Anyway, step number 2 is to make a broad strokes timeline. This can be as detailed or as sparse as you want it to be, but just having an idea of what specific events took place when is really helpful, sort of like making a physical map for your geography. Some general points you could include is, when did humans first settle in this area? When was the first major city or town founded? You can also make note of massive tragedies such as war, famine, or plague that resulted in the population or society as a whole weakening in some way. Major technological breakthroughs are also a big one. The amount of time that a technology has been in place and the amount of time that it's been widely available will really impact what your society looks like. For example, think about, society 10 years after the first car was invented versus society now. It's a huge difference, right? Another thing here is major moments of contact with other civilizations/species. This can be war, or this can be peaceful talks. It can be anything, really. Basically just that awakening or awareness of other people being out there. Step number 3 is to flesh out any historical details, especially any events that feel relevant to your current society. Ask yourself why a lot. Why did this happen? Why are people like this? Why are clothes like this? Etc., etc. It's also totally okay to justify your little world building quirks that you came up earlier on retroactively. I came up with like a really dumb and hyper specific example, but I'm just gonna go for it because I think it kind of illustrates the point pretty well. This is like worse than the birds one. For example, if everyone in your fantasy society is really obsessed with magic stones and they are super rare and very sought after, a reason why could be that they were banned from this specific country until 10 or so years ago. They're imported exclusively from a small reclusive country of like warlocks. This little warlock country has been facing trade pressure for their magic stones from multiple other global powers, so they're becoming more and more reclusive, more and more isolationist, and they're shipping out less and less of their stones. This creates even less supply against a growing international demand. 5 years ago, a scientist from your fantasy world managed to successfully synthesize an alternative to the magic stones in his lab, or her lab, women in STEM. However, these new magic stones are way more unstable and way more dangerous, and they're much harder to use. However, they're also so cheap that the black market has just been flooded with them, and it's kind of really difficult to tell a counterfeit from a real one until you use it. Anyway, the prevalence of these fake, very combustible, and sort of scary magic stones has created a problem for local law enforcement, so they sent an appeal to the government, and the government successfully confiscated a good number of legitimate magic stones, safe ones, from the people who had them originally, which was mainly upper class people. This created problems for everyone. The cops now use the legitimate magic stones to take down black market magic stone users. This is so dumb. But do you kind of see where I went with that? Like, I started asking myself why. I sort of went rolling with the history. I came up with random things on the spot and just connected them to create this like background for the magic stones that explains why they are there, why they're sought out, why they're causing issues. Number 4 here is just a bunch of questions to ask yourself. This is not a conclusive list by any means. Number 1 is, how did humans arrive in this particular region? Where did humans originate from? Are there any cultural links that connect them to their past, or are they completely detached from that era of their History. What was here before the humans came? Were there any ancient civilizations? What was the natural landscape like? What changed in the presence of humans and what's changing still? What resources were humans using to survive and thrive? Did different regions have different resources? What was prized more and what was prized less? Which areas became more economically prosperous as a result? Were any wars fought over these resources? How has human society evolved since it began in this area? What's different now? What technological advancements or shifts in power or thought have shaped society? How have humans historically overcome barriers to potential expansion? Has this resulted in any conflicts? Do humans in this world keep a written record of their past? What do they think of their past? Does this differ based off of class, race, gender, or other demarcations? What have people learned or not learned from history's lessons? What divisions have existed between people in the past? How does this impact society now? What does leadership or power look like in this world? How have concepts of leadership and power changed over time? What belief systems exist? How have they changed over time, and how have they shaped society and individual morality? I will put this list of questions in the description box, and I'll sort of add onto it as I come up with more. Otherwise, we are done for the day, and we have successfully covered geography, ecology, and history in fantasy world building. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys next time, probably with the next installment of this series. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see. Next time, we'll be covering culture, identity, and language. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.